Wyoming Territory, August 1882. The baby was already crying when Boyd O'Krieg opened his front door, barefoot and half-dressed, with a rifle slung in one hand and the other rubbing sleep from his eyes. He froze. There on the wooden porch, wrapped tight in a faded blue blanket, was a baby in a wooden crate lined with hay. A small bottle lay tipped over beside the child, still warm to the touch. What in God's name? Boyd muttered, crouching down. The baby, no more than a few months old, had a tuft of soft dark hair and fat fists waving wildly in the morning air. His cheeks were red from the chill, but he looked healthy. Boyd blinked, heart thudding. He looked out across the quiet prairie. Nothing but brush, dust, and the long stretch of dirt road leading into the hills. Then he heard the horse. Hoofbeats thudded fast and hard, and a rider appeared over the ridge, slim and upright in the saddle, cloak billowing behind her. She pulled up fast, dismounted without a word, and walked straight toward him like she had every right to be there. Boyd didn't lower the rifle. The woman stopped at the foot of the porch, her eyes locked on his gray-green, tired and serious. She looked about his age, mid-20s, with wind-blown brown hair braided back tight and dust on her boots and skirt. "You're Boyd O'Krieg?" she asked. "Who's asking?" "My name is Helena Maeve McCarthy," she said. "And that baby is yours." Boyd stared at her like she had slapped him. "I have never met you in my life," he said slowly. Helena's jaw tightened. "I know, but that does not change the truth." Boyd lowered the rifle just a bit. "Lady, I think you've got me confused with someone else." "I do not," Helena said. She stepped closer, her boots hitting the first step. "That child's name is Matthew. He was born in May. His mother, my sister, died 2 weeks ago in Colorado. Before she passed, she gave me a letter. It said she met you one night in Cheyenne last summer. She never told you she was with child." Boyd's stomach dropped. He searched his memory. "Last July, Cheyenne. A dance hall, whiskey, a girl with soft hands and a sad laugh. He hadn't even known her name. She had left before sunrise." He looked down at the baby again. "Matthew, you rode all the way from Colorado with him?" Boyd asked, stunned. "I did," Helena said. "Because she asked me to bring him to his father, and now I have." Boyd stood upright, rifle forgotten, eyes pinned on her. "You could have left a note, dropped him and gone." "I am not a coward," Helena said. "And I would not abandon a child without seeing the man who helped bring him into this world." Boyd lifted Matthew from the crate carefully. The baby quieted the moment he touched him, blinking up at Boyd like he already knew him. It hit Boyd like a punch to the chest. He swallowed hard. "You are saying this is mine?" "I am," Helena said, "and I do not have the means to raise him." "Then why not keep him with kin?" "We have no kin left," she said flatly. "My sister and I were the last." Boyd looked at her again, really looked. Her clothes were simple but clean, her face drawn from travel and grief. But there was steel in her spine. She was not the kind to beg. "You came all this way alone," he said. Helena nodded. "And you expected what exactly?" "I expected you to do the right thing," she said. "And I expected it to be hard." Boyd looked down at the baby in his arms. Matthew blinked up at him, calm now, like he belonged there. Boyd let out a long breath and nodded once. "All right." Helena's shoulders eased. "You can stay the night," he added. "You look like you have not slept in a while." "I have not." "There is coffee inside, and a wash basin." Helena hesitated. "I am not asking you to stay forever," Boyd said, "but the boys had a long ride and you look about ready to drop." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." Boyd turned, pushed the door open with his boot, and carried the baby inside. Helena followed, quiet as a shadow. The cabin was small, just one room, with a stone hearth, a worn table, and a cot in the corner. Boyd laid Matthew in a wooden cradle near the fire, then went to ladle water into the kettle. Helena stood awkwardly near the door, back straight, hands clasped. "You can sit," Boyd said. She nodded but did not move. "I do not know how to raise a child," Boyd admitted. "Neither do I," Helena said. They looked at each other. "I guess we will learn," he said. Helena gave a small, tired smile. "Yes, I suppose we will." They sat in silence as the kettle whistled. Boyd poured coffee into 2 mugs, handed her one, and sat across from her at the table. "You said your sister passed 2 weeks ago," he asked. Helena nodded. "It was fever. Quick, I am sorry." "She had a hard life," Helena said quietly. "But she loved that child. She wanted him safe." Boyd looked at Matthew, now sleeping softly in the cradle. "He will be." Helena looked over at the baby, her eyes glassy. "You can rest here for a few days," Boyd said. "Then you can decide what you want to do." Helena's gaze returned to him. "What if I am not sure?" Boyd hesitated. "Then stay until you are." Helena nodded. That night, Boyd gave her the cot and took the floor by the fire. Matthew stirred once, fussed, then settled again when Boyd touched his shoulder. Helena watched him, quiet and still. "You are good with him," she said softly. "I never expected to be. Neither did I." Boyd looked up at her. "You are not what I expected either." She smiled faintly. "What did you expect? Someone angry, someone who would drop him and ride." "I was angry," she said, "but not at you." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at the baby again. "He has her eyes." Helena's voice was quiet. "Yes." Boyd did not say anything else. But when he looked up at Helena again, something passed between them, simple and quiet but real. They had both lost something. And now, maybe, they were finding something else, together. Helena rose before the sun, easing herself off the cot without a sound. The cabin was cool, the hearth's coals only faintly glowing, and Boyd still lay on the floor wrapped in a wool blanket, one arm stretched out as if he'd meant to reach for something and forgot. She moved quietly past him and crouched near the cradle. Matthew slept with his mouth slightly open, one fist curled tight against his chest. She stepped outside to the lean-to behind the cabin. The pump handle stuck halfway down, but it gave with a few hard yanks, and water gushed into the tin pail. She splashed her face, then wiped her hands down her skirts and looked out toward the distant ridge. Grass swayed pale gold in the first light, and somewhere a meadowlark called. The door creaked behind her. "You always up this early?" She turned. Boyd stood in the doorway, shirt unbuttoned, suspenders hanging loose, eyes still heavy with sleep. His voice was rough, like gravel turned slow. "I'm used to it," she said. "Travel makes a habit of waking early." He nodded and stepped down to the yard. "I'll see to the horses. That roan of yours, he favor oats or grass." "He's not mine," she said, setting the pail aside. "Borrowed him from a man in Trinidad. Paid with my last silver brooch." Boyd glanced at her sideways. "You planning to return him?" "I gave my word. I'll ride back when I can pay a teamster for the trail." He nodded, then headed toward the small corral beyond the barn. She watched him unlatch the gate, move slow and steady among the horses like he'd been doing it since boyhood. His movements were plain but careful, like he understood that gentleness came in quiet, not softness. Inside, she laid the table with what she could find: a crock of molasses, a small sack of cornmeal, and a jar of lard sealed with wax. Boyd came in as she was greasing the skillet. "You cook?" he asked, washing his hands at the basin. "Well enough to keep from starving. I've been living off jerky and boiled beans." "I figured." He poured a cup of water and leaned against the counter. "You work?" "I did before," she said. "Laundry and mending in boarding houses. Sometimes I took in children when their mothers cleaned saloons. And now, I don't know yet." She dropped spoonfuls of batter into the skillet. They hissed and browned quick in the heat. "I could use help here," he said after a moment. "There's more to do than I can manage." Fences, stock, winter stores. I didn't come to settle. I'm not asking you to, he paused. But you're here now. Helena flipped the cakes onto a plate, then set them on the table. She sat, poured a little molasses into a tin cup and dipped a piece of cornbread into it. Boyd joined her, ate in silence for a while, then pushed his plate back. "Where'd you learn to ride like that?" he asked. "My uncle drove a freight wagon out of Laramie. I went with him summers after the cholera." She didn't explain which cholera or who it had taken. Boyd nodded slowly. "You ever think about leaving the territory?" "I used to." She brushed crumbs from her lap. "I don't anymore." "Why not?" "Because I've seen enough rail towns and mining camps to know peace doesn't come looking for you. You build it where you can." The baby stirred. Helena stood and crossed to the cradle, lifting him with practiced ease. She walked with him in the crook of her arm, humming something low and tuneless. Boyd watched her. "You sing?" he asked. "No." "But he fusses less if I pretend." He smiled without showing teeth, just a soft shift around the eyes. Then he rose and reached for his hat. "I've got to ride out to the south fence. Storm last week took down a few posts." She looked over, still rocking the baby. "You trust me here by myself? You got here across 300 miles of nothing but dust and rough country," he said, pulling his coat on. "I'd be a fool not to." Helena's expression didn't change, but something in her shoulders eased. Boyd stepped to the door, then paused. "I'll be back before dusk. If you need anything, there's a rifle above the hearth. Load's true." "I know how to use one," she said. "I figured." He left, and the door shut behind him with a soft click. Helena stood there for a long while, Matthew dozing against her shoulder, the early light warming the floorboards. She looked around the cabin. It was plain and weather-worn, patched chinks in the walls, a sag in the shelf above the hearth, but everything was in its place. Orderly. Quiet. She had not known quiet like this in years. She sat in the rocker and held the child close. Her mind wandered to her sister's face when she'd last seen her, to the sound of the train whistle leaving Denver, to the letter she still kept folded between the pages of her psalter. She did not cry. Helena had not cried since the winter of '78 and did not intend to start now. But she watched the fire catch on a fresh log and thought, perhaps, peace could be coaxed into staying if a body moved slow enough not to frighten it off. Rain came in the night, a slow, steady fall that tapped on the roof like a soft reminder. By morning, the air smelled of wet earth and sage, and the hills wore a low gray mist. Helena stood at the window, arms folded, watching the clouds stretch thin above the cottonwoods. Behind her, Matthew stirred in his cradle, fussing light in his sleep. She turned at the sound of Boyd's boots on the porch. He came in with his coat damp and his hair darker from the wet. He carried a bundle of firewood, which he set by the hearth without a word. "You get caught in it?" she asked, turning from the window. "Started as I reached the rise," he said, straightening. Fence held. A few deer passed near the north trail. She reached for the kettle. "I'll warm the last of the beans." He hung his coat near the door and sat on the bench by the hearth, rubbing his hands near the flame. "Do you ever go into town?" she asked, not looking up from the stove. "Only when I have to." "Supplies, trade, the odd telegram. People know you there. They know my name. That's enough." She set 2 bowls on the table. "I'll need cloth if I'm to mend his clothes. He's growing fast. I've got a chest in the loft, some blankets my ma stitched." "Might be something there you can use." Helena sat. "You keep much from back then?" Boyd looked at her across the table. "Only what mattered." She didn't press him, didn't have to. Instead, she reached for the bread heel and tore it in half, offering him the larger piece. "I've been thinking," she said, keeping her tone even. "If I'm to stay through the season, I'll need to earn it." "You already brought him here," Boyd said. "That counts more than most things. I didn't come for charity." He nodded, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. There's a root cellar behind the barn, but it's near empty. If you're willing, we could start drying meat and gathering what's left in the wild. I know how to stretch a harvest. Then we'll work together. She paused, then met his gaze. Do you want to raise him alone? Boyd's jaw moved once before he answered. I don't want to do it wrong. That's not what I asked. He looked down at the table, then back up. No, I don't. Helena sat back, folding her hands in her lap. Then we should stop pretending we're waiting for something to change. Boyd's eyes didn't leave hers. You planning to stay? I'm thinking of it. The baby let out a sharp cry, and Helena rose at once, lifting him into her arms. She paced across the room, bouncing him gently. Boyd watched her, quiet. He settles easiest when I hum, she said after a moment. But I ran out of songs 2 days ago. I could carve a rattle, Boyd offered. Something to keep his hands busy. You used to, when the winters were long. She looked over her shoulder. You'll show me, if you like. That evening, after the chores were done and the rain had moved on, Boyd brought a block of pine inside and his whittling knife. He sat on the step, the fire behind him, and began to shape the wood. Helena watched from the rocking chair, Matthew asleep against her chest. What was she like? Boyd asked without looking up. Helena didn't answer right away. Then, she was stubborn, sharper than most. She made up stories when there was nothing good to talk about. Did she want something different? She wanted something steady. A place that didn't move. Boyd nodded. I didn't give her that. She never blamed you. She knew what it was. He set down the knife. The rattle was half-formed, smooth along the edges. I don't remember her face, he said quietly. That night, it wasn't meant to last. I know. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. I've seen men run from less, Boyd said. You didn't. I gave my word. He stood and crossed to her, the carved shape in one hand. He held it out. For him, he said. Helena took it gently. It's beautiful. It's not finished. She looked up at him. Neither are we. Boyd didn't speak, but something changed in his eyes, steady and certain, like a man who'd decided the ground beneath his feet was worth staying on. She rose, still holding the baby, and they stood close in the firelight, the quiet between them not needing to be filled. Tomorrow would come with more work, and the next day after. But tonight, there was warmth and safety and the beginning of something they both had thought was long behind them, and they stood in it together. By late September, the wind came with a sharper edge, and the light settled into a cooler, paler gold that lingered low across the hills. Boyd had started stacking wood against the north wall of the cabin, and Helena had begun sewing small shirts from the cuttings of old flannel. Matthew had outgrown the cradle, so Boyd built a low sleeping box from pine boards, sanding the corners smooth while Helena padded the inside with wool she'd carded herself. One evening, after supper, Helena sat on the floor sorting dried beans into sacks as Boyd cleaned his tack by lamplight. How long have you owned this land? She asked without looking up. He dipped a rag into the oil tin. Bought it 8 years ago after the army let me out. You served, he nodded, 6th Cavalry, mostly patrols along the Platte. She paused in her sorting. You see much fighting, enough to recognize the sound of grief before it opens its mouth. She didn't press. Instead, she tied off the last of the sacks and dusted her hands. My father fought in the war, lost a piece of his leg at Shiloh. Never could sit still after. Boyd looked over, his hand resting on the bridle. Your mother, gone before I turned 10. Fever took her fast. He nodded once, then leaned back in his chair. Funny how some things follow you and others vanish without asking. Helena rose and hung the sacks near the window, careful to keep them off the floor. I used to think I'd end up a governess. Thought I'd wear stiff collars and teach Latin in some prairie schoolhouse. You'd have made a sharp one, She gave a small laugh. I had the posture for it, not the stomach. You ever think about what you want now? She turned to face him fully. Not in a long time. What about you? I used to dream about building a cattle line from here to Cheyenne. Thought I'd run a string of stock and never come back empty-handed. And now, he stood and poured the lamp a fresh splash of kerosene. Now I figure peace is worth more than profit. Helena crossed to the hearth, where the baby lay dozing beneath a folded quilt. She touched his back lightly, then turned toward Boyd. He's starting to recognize us, she said. He smiles when you come in from the field. Boyd looked at the child, then back to her. He'll know he belongs, that's what matters. She stepped closer. And what about us? Boyd didn't answer right away. He set the bridle aside, wiped his hands, then looked at her. I don't know the shape of what this is yet, he said, but I know it feels like something real. Helena stepped within reach. I wasn't sure if I'd be wanted here past the frost. Don't say things you don't mean to test me. I'm not. He took her hand, rough fingers closing over hers. If you stay, he said, it's because you choose to, not out of debt, not out of duty. She looked at him a long moment, her grip steady. I've never stayed anywhere without being needed. You're needed, she nodded, lips parting to speak, but the sound never came. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead lightly against his. The fire beside them cracked, throwing soft orange light across the walls. Boyd didn't move, not away and not forward. Just stood there grounded like the ridge stone above the creek. When Helena finally drew back, her voice was quieter than the wind outside. Then I'll stay. Boyd's shoulders eased and something in his eyes shifted, not joy, not relief, but certainty. I'll build you your own shelf, he said, for your books. And a place for your stitching. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I'd like that. They turned, both looking down at Matthew, who had begun to stir in his sleep. Helena bent and lifted him with practiced ease, his head settling against her collarbone. Boyd reached to adjust the edge of the quilt around the baby's legs. It was a small moment, but it held the weight of something settled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the night deepened without storm or threat. Inside, 3 hearts beat close beneath a single roof, each one learning, slowly, how to lean into the others. The last of the sorrel leaves had turned, dry and copper-red, when Boyd came in from the southern slope carrying a rabbit and a handful of late-season chokecherries. Helena was kneeling near the hearth, wrapping a bundle of herbs in cotton and tying it with thread from her mending kit. He set the rabbit on the table, then dropped the berries into the tin basin. "You been out gathering, near the creek bed," she replied, standing and brushing her hands on her apron. "There's still yarrow holding on under the rocks. I'll dry it for colds." Boyd nodded toward the bundle. "You know plants, my mother did," Helena said. "I watched more than I was taught, but it stuck." He picked up one of the herbs gently. "You trust it." "I trust the land more than I trust most people." Boyd looked up at her, thoughtful. "You ever think about teaching him that?" "I plan to." Her words were quiet but full of intent, and it settled something between them that hadn't yet been named. She walked to the hutch and took down a clean cloth, setting it near the rabbit. "You want help dressing it?" she asked. "I'll manage. I'll make the bread then." They moved around each other with the easy rhythm that had grown between them, unspoken, but steady. Helena kneaded dough while Boyd worked the knife, the sound of metal against wood soft beneath the rustling wind outside. As she shaped the loaf, she glanced over. "You always planned to live alone?" "No," he said, not looking up, "but I didn't think I'd be trusted again." Helena dusted flour from her hands. "You were married," he paused, then nodded. "Years ago, it didn't hold." She left before the first spring came. "What happened?" she said. "I kept too much to myself, that I was always waiting for something to go wrong." Helena folded the cloth over the dough. "And were you?" He met her eyes. "I think I was waiting for someone who wouldn't leave." She held his gaze for a long moment, then stepped closer. "I don't run from what's mine." Boyd's voice was low. "Is this yours?" "I think it could be." The space between them closed with quiet understanding. He reached out and touched her wrist, not hurried, not uncertain, and she leaned into the contact like it was the most natural thing in the world. That night, after supper, Helena rocked Matthew by the fire while Boyd carved another toy, a small horse with rounded edges. She watched his hands move with care, the firelight catching in the grooves of the wood. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked. "From my uncle. He was a cooper, but he liked to keep his hands busy in the evenings." She smiled softly. "I like watching you work." Boyd looked over. "I like knowing you're near." She stood and crossed to him, Matthew now asleep against her shoulder. "We don't need to wait anymore, Boyd. Not for the right time or the right words." He rose slowly, setting the carving aside. "You sure?" "I've never been more." He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his thumb grazing her skin. "Then you stay for good." "I already have." They kissed there in the firelight, slow and certain, the kind that doesn't ask permission because it's already been given. It was not hurried or breathless, but full of something deeply rooted, like the cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. The next morning, Boyd hitched the wagon and drove into town with Helena by his side and Matthew bundled between them. They visited the clerk's office, signed the license with steady hands, and were married in the small clapboard church down the lane. No guests, no music, just the quiet vow of two people who had already weathered enough to know what real promises were worth. They returned home that evening beneath a sky brushed with lavender and rust. Helena unpacked the small cedar chest she'd kept closed since Denver and set her books on the new shelf Boyd had built for her. He placed the carved horse beside them. That winter, the snow came early, but the cabin stayed warm. Helena taught Boyd how to bind herbs into teas, and he taught her how to mend fencing without splitting the boards. They slept side by side, Matthew tucked close, the wind whistling harmlessly beyond the walls. In spring, they planted rows of potatoes and onions, and Boyd built a second cradle for the child Helena now carried. Her belly grew slow and strong with the season, and Boyd made a habit of resting his hand there each night, listening without words. By the end of the year, the farm was running easier, and Helena had found her rhythm in the land. She traded dried herbs for sewing thread at the mercantile and was known in town for her calm way with children and her honey bread. Boyd, once known only for his quietness and solitude, now walked with a steadiness that came from being seen and trusted. He no longer waited for something to break. He no longer held back. They lived on with hard work and soft mornings, with hands that met in the dark and laughter that came easier with time. Their love was not loud or spoken often, but present in every small thing, in the way he brought her water before she asked, in the way she warmed his coat by the fire before he rode out. And when the second child came, a girl with Helena's eyes and Boyd's quiet way, they named her Mercy. Because some things, once lost, still find their way back. They raised their children on that land, with the rhythm of seasons and the promise of morning light. And through all of it, Boyd and Helena stood side by side, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Every day. For the rest of their lives.